myself, I flew with McRoberts and Miller Airlines for some 32 years, and I logged 21,500 hours, some of that in your. Over a period of 50 years, MMA operated variously de Havilland Dragons, Lockheed 10A Electras, 8 DC-3s, 6 F-27 Friendships, and 10 F-28 jets, over a network of approximately 180 aerodromes in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, from Esperance in the south to Darwin in the north, and out to Groote Island on the Gulf of Carpentaria, and Alice Springs in the Red Centre. At the time of this story, in 1957, I was just a lowly first officer with 2 years service, and got to know the western half of Australia quite well until I retired in 1986. To give an idea of the size of Western Australia, Texas, the biggest state in the USA, we are told, was in 4 times. Sorry, Americans, but you know, we get passionate enough about Texas, so get our own back sometime. So the concept, you can see the concept of sending cattle by air began with Doug Blythe of Mount House Station. He was an Australian Army sergeant on Bougainville in 1944, watching the Air Force DC-3s bring in the supplies, and he mulled over the concept of transporting beef by air to save on the 6 weeks of driving cattle to the meatworks at Wyndham, with consequent loss of condition. By processing top condition beasts on the spot, the travel time could be shortened to 1 hour and 20 minutes. Stations feeding their beef at Glenroy, and depicted here were Bedford and Fossil Downs, Gibb River, Gogo, Mount Hart, Mount House, Kurungi, Lansdowne, Springvale and Table. Very big area, and you can see the distance involved in taking cattle by ground. A trial run of the concept was begun at Mount House Station. The beast was on the gimlet there, that's called the gimlet, where the outback used to do their slaughtering. The bullock was slaughtered and dressed, and had an average weight of 660 pounds. An MMA Lockheed Electra arrives at Mount House, part of Mount House Hill on the left there. It was there to pick up the carcass and transport it 1,400 miles to Perth to prove the concept. Arrival in Perth in good condition, it was examined by the health authorities and deemed fit for human consumption. It's one of McRoberts and Miller's airlines with the typical script that used to appear on the McRoberts and box of chocolates. And if you didn't know, McRoberts and Miller was merged with Ferguson Robertson, who provided the finance to make that Horry Miller organise the airline and bring it to Western Australia. And so it was called McRoberts and Miller Airlines. And the early letterheads, all the early letterheads of the company and correspondence, have all got that same McRoberts and Miller, McRobertson's chocolate script on them. I've got one at home now. So the site was chosen for the meatworks in the wide open spaces of the Kimberley. Beautiful dry season weather with an average daytime temperature of 30 degrees centigrade, not a cloud in the sky for months on end. Complete works was flown in by DC-3s mainly and erected for the 1949 season. This is the buildings half up, and next one, the abattoirs, the financial part, everything, offices are all ready to go. And originally, Australian National Airways and MMA operated in conjunction using DC-3s and the Bristol freighters. The Bristol freighter had nose opening doors and you drove up around. It was designed to take cars and buses across a channel. It worked out for a lot of other things, including beef. And that was until 1954 when MMA took over the whole operation. And like I say, a normal dry season ran for 4.5 months of the year. Engineers are responsible for the aviation operation, as you need top engineers when you're 1,400 miles from base. If you look at beside Jack Sinclair, the shorter bloke, you can see a ladder. And that ladder was for crew access to the cockpit via the front nose locker door. The thing being that the meat covered the whole of the back of the aeroplane, the whole of the fuselage of the aeroplane. However, after some little while and a couple of slips and trips, pilots decided they'd rather keep their career intact rather than squash a pound of beef every now and again, so they barred using the ladder too high, right way up there. To load the aeroplane, they had the famous gantry. The gantry rolled out from the right-hand side of your side on the pathway tracks, on rollers, as you can see, to stop at the aircraft door, to accept the meat from the chillers. Came out from over the top here, ran down on the rollers, had a little bit of an incline, but quite often needed a push to get it to the aeroplane. You can see the tail wheel is lined at 90 degrees, and that was because the aeroplane taxied in and they had a steel turntable lined up so that it placed in this exact position. And the idea was to bring the aeroplane round, turning right, and line up with the wheel on the aeroplane wheel on the turntable wheel. And so that's how the tail wheel seems to be inadequately parked. When it was loaded up, it just took the gantry away, taxied forward. Loading the aeroplane, there's always one crew. We had two crew. There's always one crew off duty, and the off-duty crew always went a hand. Everybody was one big happy family there, pilots and butchers, engineers, a lot. Ross Watts was there in his old airlines uniform. This photo was taken after 1955, obviously, because we'd gone into the MMA airlines uniform then. So Ross was just wearing out his old uniform, probably laying down a bit of seniority at the same time. Ross flew Sunderlands with 10 squadron in England in World War II. You'll notice there's no shirt, it's hot weather, and the engineer is Bob Guest, who's admiring his efforts. When Air Beef first started, the company used to post you there for the complete season. They'd pick a crew, two crews, send you off for 4.5 months. And after a while, pilots didn't like that either. So general agreement later on, we started doing shorter terms. In my term, when I told this story, was 1957, when we were doing 3 weeks, which was a great improvement. But when I went up, I left my new wife with a new baby of about 3 months, and I was gone for 3 or 4 weeks, so she was left by herself. 3 loaders manhandled heavy quarters into position on the cabin floor. They always called them quarters. And First Officer George Bailey's down there, looking pretty smart young fellow. His old man lives down at Dunsman now, like the rest of us. And he was sure that the quarter got to the guy on the top where he could get off. And you'll notice they're wearing these big leather mitts, which were to protect their hands. Ross had them on as well, against the cold and the meat, which had been in the chiller all night. Jack Murray, he was a senior pilot for 1954. He was a wartime flying instructor, along with Sid Goddard and others. And towards the end of the war, he did a bit of time on mosquitoes. After the war, he went back to university, did 3 years of dentistry, then he chucked it in and went flying again. He carried a small dental kit in his nose bag and was not adverse to a little fang farrowing for someone in pain in the wild outback. No questions asked, no fees charged. The butchering floor in the slaughterhouse. You can see some 10 carcasses visible on the conveyor belt, moving from right to left. The butchers knew if you didn't want to watch the gory side of all the killing going on and the dressings. So they give you heaps in the mess at night, choking you until you finally gave in and went and had a look. So this picture shows Captain Meadows, George Meadows, Captain Colwhite, Captain Ken Beer and F.O. Burney doing their obligatory watch of the killing floor. They probably went off and had a beer and tried to forget the whole thing. There's guts and heads and mooing and carrying them going on everywhere. Wasn't too pleasant sight. And this is the Glenroy Hilton. It's a wartime missing hut. Engineers and pilots all logged in together. Both ends are open for cooling in the daytime with a shade over the nearest beds. Murder at night time with lighting attracting every moth and beetle in the Kimberley. And when the lights went out, the mozzie started. This was VHMML on takeoff at an all-up weight of 26,900 pounds, 700 pounds above the normal airline weight. MML was a freighter, and MML did all MMA's off-airline route work, freighters, aerial survey. It did everything, went everywhere. Everything was stripped out for a maximum payload of 8,500. Cyril Kleinig was a tiger for saving weight, therefore gaining extra payload. And they took out everything out of the cabin of the aeroplane, and even the autopilot. So we had to fly the aeroplane both ways an hour, 20 minutes a time. So we got plenty of stick time in 4.5 weeks, 3 or whatever. The density altitude on a normal 30-degree day was 2,700 feet. If you look hard in the bottom left-hand side, you can see prop wash dust in the background. As for the rest, it's all a beautiful, wide open Kimberley spaces. While you're admiring the Mighty Three, a few statistics. In the 1957 season, 4,000 cattle were processed, and MML, named Linden after a West Australian river, made 182 trips to Wyndham, carrying 1.5 million pounds of meat. In addition, another 175,000 pounds to Derby, as well as 108,000 pounds of hides. Backloading for the Kimberley stations totalled over 500,000 pounds, and it was all done by this aeroplane every season. The DC-3 cockpit, captain's flight instruments on the left, the autopilot control box in the centre, and the FO's engine instruments on the right-hand side. The FO only had instruments to look at, but he always flew looking about 30 degrees left at the autopilot and AH and DG. That was his sole flight instrument. And you can see the Morse code key on the sill on the right-hand side, which was mainly the FO's job and pleasure if you had to use Morse at any stage. B float en route. The meat is now all distributed along the floor. It's heavily covered in with a plastic nose, but tarpaulins, and was well covered and fully strapped down. And you can notice the cockpit doors open, and we also flew with both the cockpit windows open to provide ventilation. And that's why we usually walked over to get to the cockpit after we found a ladder. First officer's view of the big 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. We always called it right and left in those days, but given up the same port and starboard. This is taken out of the FO's window en route, tracking along the Coburn Ranges to Wyndham. The Morse key is still there and quite easy to get at. And I remember when I was with ANA, and even in early MNA days, we were still using HF and Morse sometimes. I used to pick up the flight plan or whatever was handy and just practice tapping the Morse out on it just for something to do. I was never bored in the cockpit. I never read a newspaper or a magazine. I was always doing something. I liked it, just had to go and tap-tapping. If we ever had to send a Morse code message, the The operators used to laugh and said, "There's that bloody pilot again, they can't about that." But it was good fun and interesting to do it now and again. A picture of Alec Whittam, the chief pilot, and Alec joined MMA back in 1937. This picture is obviously taken before 1955 because it still says McRoberts Miller Aviation. It might have been 1955 or earlier, because in October 55 we merged with Airlines WA Limited and became McRoberts Miller Airlines. Normal backloading was anything from the stores, fencing, wire, machinery, etc. You name it, we carried it. Inside of the backloading, you can see a whole group of stuff there. All you're going to easy chairs weren't for pilots who were too busy. Another backloading was distillate to run the powerhouse, self-powered. This was a rubber fuel bladder holding 222 gallons of distillate. It was made by Dunlop to an MMA specification, and it weighed 1,920 pounds full to run the powerhouse, as I said. You could see even in those days 2 fire extinguishers early at hand for if needed. Bob Deal, the engineers did weekend maintenance on their own engine, and each engineer had two. They had their own engine. Bob was a well-liked bloke with a very strong attitude, and he was always known as Big Deal. got the cowls off, and if you don't know whether he's got any shade with it, it used to get so hot out in handing that metal. You've got to stand there, but we had an engine failure once at Wave Hill, and had to do an engine change there, and there were no stands, and those poor engineers sitting up on top, to sit up on top of the engine, and that you were fried eggs on the metal. These are the hides, the leftovers from their slaughter, and they were stacked ready. They've done a bit of basic tanning, and you can see they're folded, and they're stacked ready for transport to Derby and then onwards to a tannery. I call this a cold beer after a hard day's work sweating over a hot control column. The duty day, for the duty day, the first trip was at 0600, the second was at 10:30, and the third was at 14:30. One crew did 2 trips, and the other crew did 1, and they alternated that each day. Shown there are Captain Peter King, FO Colt Chapman, who incidentally did 13 trips as a Lancaster air gunner with Bomber Command. He wanted to be a pilot. He was 44, he could see him starting to get too many pilots, and he deliberately kept failing his course till they made him an air gunner. And that's what he wanted. They sent him to England, and he did 13 trips before the war finished. Captain, there's myself there. I can't believe it, but I'm wearing one of those gob hats that thank goodness I haven't got it turned around back to front. And Ken Beer, who flew Beauforts in New Guinea. Unfortunately, Peter King died a few years later in his sleep while on it whilst an overnight in Port Edwin. And we were now down to a small 2-bedroom hut to escape the wartime missing hut, which I saw earlier, and also to allow the second crew to get a sleep. After work, we quite often played tennis on an ant-bird court, which we'll probably be doing after that, ant-bird court, in matches commonly known as pilots versus the butchers. It was interesting to meet another group of people earning their living, paying off mortgages and bringing up their kids, and the type of work the average person never sees or even wants to, slaughtering. Another hazard, in particular on the takeoff at Glenroy and other parts of the country too, but we're at full maximum all-up weight all the time, with the local coyotes, which were big brown birds and a menace around our takeoff path on takeoff of our all-up weights. To this ending the story goes, Peter King waged a private war by getting scrap lumps of meat from the butchers tying them together with a length of string and lacing them with strychnine. The idea was that one bird would swoop down and fly off one bait, another would swoop in and grab the second piece, and they would have got rid of two in one go. Whether it worked or not, I never heard. The result of such a bird strike is pictured here. This was a passenger flight near Port Keats in August 1959 with Captain Ross Watts and First Officer Dick Evans. They were on the cruise at 2,500 feet and 140 knots. Windscreen of the DC-3 was 5/8 of an inch thick. The bird came through the window, it showered Dick with glass, blood and feathers, went through the open cockpit door, right along the hull, and stopped up against the buffet at the rear of the cabin. Also sending blood and feathers all over air hostess Beverly Doherty, who took this photo. And Bev still lives down at Albany, God bless. So any Friday, possibly we've even got the right-hand storm window for a little bit of extra vision out of the storm window. This title page of the 1957 annual report shows another facet of air transport with stud bulls probably headed for Fossil Downs. During the period between 1948 and the ending of the air beef operation in 1962, with the introduction of the Commonwealth Beef Roads funding, ANA and MMA had flown to the local and export market the prodigious total of approximately 32,250,000 pounds of dressed beef, offal and hides, mainly in MMA, which never missed a beat. These are cowboy rangers, courtesy of Brian, some from his little collection. Beautiful country to fly over, beautiful colours, and when you landed at Wyndham at 7 in the morning, 7:30, and even late on the F-27 days at the same time, you'd look out to the flat top mesas, and it was just like being back in the old Western cowboy days, really magic, beautiful country. Township of Wyndham, at the foot of the bastion. The bastion had a bit of a slope there. There's a bit of a story about one of our first officers and the hostess who decided they'd climb up the hill in the afternoon to take a photo of the town from the top. They got to the top. While they're up there, it got too late to go down. They couldn't see the steps, so they spent the night on the mountain together. And that was another story that went around. They're all pretty harmless. And MMF, that's a photo of MMF, but that was DC-3 in its glory days. And this is a photo of what's left of Glenroy that was taken last year. It was really only a few yards and a cattle loading ramp. And I did say to the fellow that took it, said, oh, there's also the windsock mast there, but the windsock's long gone. In the 1970s, 80s, and 80s, MMA was Australia's third largest airline after Ansett and TAA. In those days, the president incumbent, Sky West, with just one little commercial Cessna 172 operating around the back blocks of Carnarvon. Our fleet progressed through the heady years of the iron ore, gas, oil and salt boom from the DC-3s through the F-27, the mighty Friendship, MMS and the rest, and to the F-28s. This image shows an early morning departure day. Most days of the week, 6 aeroplanes lined up ready for departure. First one off at 6 o'clock, one every 5 minutes after that, and they disappeared all over West Australia and Northern Territory. MMA survived for nearly 50 years, then suffered numerous name changes until 1993, when it was finally gobbled up by the Ansett bean counters, who had incidentally got so good at their job that they did it to themselves some years later. I hope you enjoyed a look at a small part of a great airline's West Australia and Northern Territory operations. And as Jack Davey used to say once on radio many years ago in the 50s, thanks for listening.